Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband told me for 20 years that we could barely make ends meet. But one day, I found his secret hiding place under the stairs. Inside was an old safe with $10 million in cash. I said nothing. I waited until he fell asleep and... Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. For 20 years, I thought I knew exactly what my life was. A modest house on Clover Street in Columbus, Ohio. A husband who worked long hours as a mid-level accountant. 2 kids who'd grown up and moved away. A budget that never seemed to stretch far enough, no matter how carefully I planned the groceries or clipped the coupons on Sunday mornings. That was my life with Daniel. Quiet, honest, small, or so I believed. My name is Laura Mercer. I'm 51 years old, and I am not a dramatic woman. I don't exaggerate. I don't catastrophize. I was a school librarian for 19 years before I took early retirement. And if that tells you anything about a person, it tells you this. I believe in facts, in records, in the quiet, patient accumulation of evidence. So when I tell you what I found and what I did about it, understand that every word of it is true. Daniel and I met when we were both 28. He was dependable in the way a good appliance is dependable, always present, rarely exciting, and you only notice it when something goes wrong. He wasn't unkind. He wasn't a drunk or a gambler, at least not as far as I knew. He simply was. And for a long time, I told myself that was enough. The money was always tight, or rather, Daniel always said it was tight. We can't afford a vacation this year, Laura. That was a recurring sentence, repeated so many times over 2 decades that it had lost all meaning, like a word you say too often until it sounds strange in your mouth. We couldn't afford to fix the back porch properly, so it warped and groaned every winter. We couldn't afford a newer car, so I drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a crack in the dashboard until last year. We couldn't afford to help our daughter, Meg, with her student loans. And I watched her work double shifts at a restaurant for 3 years because of it. I accepted all of it, because Daniel showed me the spreadsheets. He sat me down at the kitchen table every January with his laptop and walked me through the numbers. Income, expenses, savings, projections. It all looked real. It all looked tight. But here's the thing about being a librarian. You learn to notice when a story has gaps. The first time something felt off was about 2 years ago, in March. I came home from my sister Carol's house to find Daniel on the phone in the backyard, pacing the fence line with his back turned. Nothing unusual about that, except that he ended the call the moment he saw me through the glass door. Not quickly, the way you hang up on a telemarketer. Deliberately. Like closing a drawer before someone can see inside. I told myself it was work. Daniel handled some corporate accounts. Confidentiality, I reasoned. Then there were the cash withdrawals. I only noticed because I started handling our joint account more after his mother, Patricia, moved into assisted living. Small amounts, 200 here, 300 there, always on Tuesdays. Always from the same ATM on Morse Road, miles from his office. Petty cash for client lunches, he said when I asked. You know how these things go. I did not push further. I wish I had. The thing that finally broke me open happened on a Thursday in October, 8 months ago. Daniel was visiting Patricia, which he did every week, dutiful son that he pretended to be. And I was doing what I did every few months, clearing the cobwebs from the basement storage area under the staircase. It's a low, awkward space, the kind that fills up with holiday decorations and forgotten things. I'd been meaning to reorganize it before winter. I moved a stack of old banker's boxes and felt the floor shift slightly under my foot. I stopped. I pressed my foot down again. A hollow sound. Wrong. I crouched and ran my fingers along the edge of the floorboard. It had been cut, carefully, cleanly, and fitted back with small magnetic catches, invisible unless you were looking. I worked my nails into the seam and lifted. Beneath it was a fireproof steel safe, roughly the size of a microwave oven, bolted to the concrete subfloor. I stared at it for a long time without moving. I wasn't panicking. That's the thing I remember most clearly. I wasn't shaking or crying. I was very, very still, the way the library used to go still right before closing. That particular quality of silence that means something is about to end. The safe had a combination lock. I didn't know the combination, but I noted the brand, the model number stamped on the door, and I photographed everything with my phone before I replaced the floorboard exactly as I'd found it, moved the boxes back into position, and went upstairs to start dinner. Daniel came home at 6:30. I put a plate of pasta in front of him and asked how his mother was doing. "Same as always," he said. "You know how she is." I nodded. I poured myself a glass of water, and I began to think. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was frightened, though I was, but because my mind wouldn't stop working. It kept returning to the safe the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, compulsively, carefully, unable to leave it alone. I lay beside Daniel in the dark and listened to him breathe, and I thought, who is this man? 20 years. 20 years of careful budgets and denied vacations and quiet creeping shame about money. 20 years of watching Meg work herself ragged. 20 years of a back porch that groaned every winter because we couldn't afford to fix it properly. And beneath our stairs, hidden beneath the floor he'd walked across 10,000 times. A safe. I needed to know what was in it. I told no one. Not yet. Not Carol, who would have immediately called Daniel and demanded an explanation. Not Meg, who was already fragile from the loan years. Not my friend Joyce, who meant well but had a mouth like a screen door. Nothing stayed in. I said nothing to anyone, and I went about my days with a face I'd apparently been practicing for years without knowing it. Calm, unremarkable, present. But underneath, I was calculating. The first thing I did was practical. The morning after I found the safe, I drove to a public library 2 towns over, not my old library, where people knew me, and used a guest computer to research the safe model. It was a Sentry Safe SFW 123GDC, a mid-range fireproof model sold at hardware stores and online retailers. Common, available. And here was the useful part. A well-documented factory default combination, used when owners forget the code. I wrote the number down on a piece of paper, folded it into the inner pocket of my wallet, and drove home. The second thing I did was harder. I started going through our finances, not the spreadsheets Daniel showed me, but the actual records. I requested paper statements from our bank, telling them I preferred paper for tax purposes. I went back 18 months. I sat at the kitchen table when Daniel was at work, and I read every line. What I found made my chest tight in a way I can only describe as grief. The pattern was consistent. Every third or fourth Tuesday, a cash withdrawal of $200 to $300 from the Morse Road ATM, always in amounts small enough to avoid raising automatic flags. Over 18 months, those withdrawals totaled just over $6,000. $6,000 that had gone somewhere I couldn't trace. And that was only what I could see. I thought about what I couldn't see. If there was cash in that safe, real cash, physical bills, it would leave no digital trail. It couldn't be traced through a bank statement. It existed outside the record entirely. That was the point. That had always been the point. For 3 days, I walked around with this knowledge sitting in my chest like a stone. I made dinner. I asked about his day. I laughed at something on television. And every night I lay awake in the dark and tried to understand what I was dealing with. Was Daniel hiding money from me? From the IRS? From both? Had he been doing this our entire marriage, or had something changed? Was there another person involved? Another account? Another life? Another woman? That last thought surprised me with how little it hurt. That was when I understood something important. I wasn't grieving my marriage anymore. I had already, somewhere in the past sleepless hours, accepted that it was over. What I felt now wasn't heartbreak. It was something colder and more focused. I will not walk away from 20 years with nothing. That was the thought that crystallized everything. I was 51. I had given up my career trajectory, twice moved cities for Daniel's job, managed our household, raised our children largely alone because he worked so hard. I had lived small because he told me we had to, and if there was money, real money hidden and hoarded, then half of it was mine by any moral and likely legal standard. I needed to move carefully. If Daniel suspected I knew, he could empty the safe, move the money, disappear it entirely. Cash is, by its nature, portable. I could not confront him. I could not let him see any change in me. I needed time, information, and someone I could trust completely. I thought about that last requirement for a long time. Then I remembered Karen Solis. Karen had been a colleague at the library, a quiet, meticulous woman who had left the profession to become a paralegal, and who had helped her sister navigate a complicated divorce 3 years earlier. Karen was discreet. Karen understood documents. And Karen, I knew, did not like Daniel. She'd met him twice at library events and told me afterward, with characteristic bluntness, "He talks over you, Laura. You know that, right?" I called her from the parking lot of a grocery store, so Daniel couldn't overhear. "Karen," I said when she picked up, "I need to talk to you. Not on the phone, in person." There was a short pause. "How serious is this?" I watched a woman push a cart across the parking lot, a small child riding in the seat, kicking his feet in the sun. "I found something," I said, "and I need to understand what my options are before I do anything." "Okay," Karen said quietly. "Come to my office, Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Don't tell Daniel." "I wasn't planning to," I said. I hung up and sat in the car for a moment with my hands in my lap. Then I drove home and made lunch. And when Daniel asked how my morning was, I told him it was fine. It was the first real lie I ever told him on purpose. It felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. Karen's office was in a low brick building near downtown Westerville, the kind of place that housed insurance adjusters and notary publics, and quiet, serious people who dealt in paperwork and consequence. I arrived at 8:55. I wore the same cardigan I wore to parent-teacher conferences, neutral, forgettable, and I carried a folder with the bank statements I'd printed at the library. Karen was already there, coffee in hand, door closed. She looked at me the way people look at someone who has just walked in from the rain, with concern and without surprise. "Sit down," she said. I sat. I told her everything. The safe, the withdrawals, the 20 years of manufactured scarcity. I kept my voice even. I laid the bank statements on her desk in chronological order. Karen didn't interrupt. She read. She made small marks in pencil on a notepad. When I finished, she set down her pencil. "Laura," she said, "you need a family law attorney, not a paralegal, an attorney." "I know. I can give you a name. She's good. She doesn't gossip, and she doesn't settle unless the client tells her to." Karen paused. "Before you go to her, have you opened the safe?" "Not yet. Do it before you see her. Whatever is in there changes the picture entirely. Document everything you find. Photograph it. Don't remove anything. Don't disturb anything beyond what you need to photograph. And Laura," she leaned forward slightly, "if there is what you think there is in that safe, you are going to need to be very careful. Men who hide money for 20 years don't do it by accident. They do it because they're protecting something." I thought about that on the drive home. The attorney Karen recommended was named Sandra Voss. Her office was in Dublin, far enough from our neighborhood that Daniel was unlikely to ever hear her name from a mutual acquaintance. I called from the grocery store parking lot. It had become my private phone booth, and scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday. The receptionist asked me the nature of the matter. "Divorce consultation," I said. The word felt strange in my mouth. Real. In the days between Karen's office and the Thursday appointment, I watched Daniel with new eyes. He hadn't changed. That was what struck me. He came home at the same time, ate dinner, watched television, went to bed. But I noticed things I'd been too accustomed to ignore. The way he angled his phone away when he typed. The way he took calls in the garage, door closed, even in November cold. The way his mother Patricia, when she called, always asked, "How are things at home?" in a tone that sounded less like affection and more like surveillance. Patricia had never liked me. I'd known that since the engagement. She was a small, composed woman from Cincinnati who had raised Daniel alone after his father left, and who had poured into her son a particular brand of devotion that left no room for a daughter-in-law. She called twice a week. She visited 6 times a year, and she always left our house looking as if she'd cataloged every room for future reference. The Wednesday before my attorney appointment, Daniel came home slightly later than usual and mentioned, casually, that he'd stopped by Patricia's facility to drop off some paperwork. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, just as casually. "Just administrative stuff, power of attorney renewal." I nodded. I served dinner. That night, at 2 a.m, when Daniel's breathing had settled into its deep, regular rhythm, I got up. I went downstairs in socks. I moved the banker's boxes in the dark, working slowly, not using my phone light until I was inside the closet with the door nearly closed. I lifted the floorboard. The safe sat in its concrete hollow, exactly as I'd left it. I unfolded the paper from my wallet. The factory default for the Century Safe SFW123GDC is 0170. I entered it. The lock disengaged with a soft, mechanical click. I opened the safe. For a moment, I simply looked. There were stacks of bills, banded, organized, dense, all hundreds. I didn't count them that night, but even in the dim light of my phone, I could see there were many. Beneath the cash were 2 things: a brown envelope sealed with packing tape, and a small black notebook with an elastic band around it. I photographed everything: the cash, The envelope, the notebook, closed. I did not open either. I closed the safe, reset the combination, replaced the floorboard, moved the boxes, went upstairs, and washed my hands at the bathroom sink. I stood at the mirror for a moment and looked at my own face. There it is, I thought. There it all is. The next morning, I drove to Sandra Voss's office in Dublin and sat down across from a calm, sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, and I said, I believe my husband has been hiding significant assets for most of our marriage. I have photographic evidence, and I'd like to understand what I'm entitled to and how to proceed without tipping him off. Sandra Voss looked at me for a beat. Then she opened a legal pad. Start from the beginning, she said. Sandra Voss was not a warm woman. She was precise and methodical, and she did not waste words, which I respected enormously. Over 3 appointments in 2 weeks, we built a picture. Sandra brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet man named Gerald Webb, who wore reading glasses on a cord and spoke about hidden assets with the detached familiarity of someone who'd seen it many times before. Gerald requested access to the past 7 years of our joint tax returns, which I photographed from Daniel's files during his Saturday golf game. He requested all bank statements I could access. He explained, without drama, that the pattern of cash withdrawals I'd identified was a textbook method of slow asset concealment, and that the likely total, based on the safe's visible contents and the withdrawal pattern, could represent a deliberately structured parallel financial life. Does he have a separate account somewhere? I asked. Almost certainly, Gerald said. Possibly more than one. We'll find them. Sandra filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't in the building when it happened. I was at Carol's house, drinking coffee and pretending to watch a home renovation program, because Sandra had told me to be somewhere I'd be remembered as calm and present. Daniel was served at his office at 11:15. I know this because Karen texted me a single word, done. I drove home and made soup. Daniel came home that evening, and the air in the house had changed. I could feel it from the moment he stepped through the door. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the envelope in his hand, still in his coat, and he looked at me as if I had become a stranger in the space of a morning. Laura. Daniel. What is this? It wasn't a question. It was a statement being tested for reality. It's a divorce filing, I said. Sandra Voss is my attorney. You should get one as well. Something crossed his face that I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not yet. Something more controlled and more frightening. He set the envelope on the counter very carefully, as if it might detonate, and he said, "We need to talk about this privately, before anyone else gets involved." "Other people are already involved," I said. "That's rather the point of a legal filing." He left the kitchen. I heard him upstairs on the phone. I imagined who he was calling. I was right. Patricia arrived the following Saturday. She didn't ring the bell. She had a key, had always had a key, a fact I had resented for years and somehow never addressed. And she walked into my kitchen at 9 in the morning while I was having coffee, sat down across from me without being invited, and folded her hands on the table with the composure of someone who had been preparing this conversation for days. "Laura," she said, "I think you've made a very impulsive decision." "Good morning, Patricia. You've been under a lot of stress. I understand that. But dragging Daniel through a public legal process over 20 years of concealed assets?" I said pleasantly. "Over a safe full of cash hidden under the floor of our home." She went very still. There it was. She knew. Of course she knew. Patricia knew everything Daniel did, because Daniel told her everything, which meant she had known about the money, possibly for years. "That money," Patricia said carefully, "belongs to this family. I am this family, I said. I'm his wife of 20 years, which means half of what he has is legally mine. Sandra Voss has already begun the discovery process. Gerald Webb is going through our tax records. If there are accounts or assets that weren't disclosed on our joint returns, that's a matter the IRS will find interesting as well as the court. Something shifted in Patricia's face then, a kind of tightening around the eyes that I recognized as fear, briefly surfacing before she controlled it. You don't know what you're getting into, she said. Her voice had dropped. There are people involved in some of his business arrangements who don't react well to interference. I'm telling you this for your sake, Laura. Drop this. Take a settlement. Be reasonable. I looked at her for a long moment. People who don't react well to interference. What was that supposed to mean? A threat? A warning? I filed it carefully in the same part of my mind where I kept the bank statements and the photographs of the safe. Thank you for your concern, I said. You can leave the key on the counter. She left without the key. She'd make a copy, I knew. I had the locks changed that afternoon. That evening, Daniel called and told me, very quietly, that I was making a mistake, that things would become complicated, that I should think carefully about what I was doing. I have thought carefully, I said. For about 20 years, I'm done thinking. I'm acting. I hung up. Then I sat in my car in the driveway for a while, because my hands were shaking and I didn't want to carry that into the house. A few days later, I drove to my sister Carol's house and spent the weekend doing absolutely nothing. We watched bad television. We cooked too much food. I slept 9 hours on Friday night, and on Saturday morning, I sat on Carol's back porch in an old sweater and watched the oak tree in her yard drop the last of its leaves. And I let myself feel, for just a little while, the terrible and particular sadness of realizing that the life you'd believed in had never quite been real. Then I came home, and I kept going. The offer came through Daniel's attorney, a man named Robert Cahill, who operated out of a glass and steel office in Columbus proper, and who, Sandra told me without inflection, was known for aggressive negotiation and slow disclosure. The offer was this: $250,000, the house, and the 2009 Civic. A clean settlement. No further discovery, no forensic accounting. Sign within 30 days, and the matter would be resolved quietly. I read it twice. Then I set it down on Sandra's desk and looked at her. What does this offer tell us? I asked. Sandra allowed herself a small smile. It tells us there's considerably more than $250,000. That was my thought exactly. When you've lived lean for 20 years, when you've clipped coupons and driven a cracked dashboard Civic and watched your daughter work double shifts, $250,000 sounds like a lot. Once, it would have sounded like freedom. But the offer was too clean, too quick, too eager for silence. It was the offer of someone who needed the discovery process to stop before it found something larger. Decline it, I said. Sandra nodded and made a note. In the weeks that followed, something interesting happened. The pressure from Daniel and Patricia became almost performative. Daniel started texting me, not the angry, cornered messages I'd expected, but carefully composed ones. I've been thinking, maybe we both made mistakes. Can we talk? Then, a few days later, Mom is really upset. She's not well, Laura. Think about what this is doing to her. Then, with escalating transparency, I can offer you more. I want to do right by you. Can we meet in person? Each message had the texture of a script. Each one was designed to pull at a specific thread: guilt, nostalgia, compassion, practicality. I recognized the mechanics of it because I had, after all, been a librarian. I knew how narrative manipulation worked. I knew that a story structured to make you feel responsible for someone else's distress was a story with an agenda. I didn't respond to any of them, but I'd be lying if I said they had no effect. There were evenings when I sat in my kitchen and the house felt very large and very quiet, and I thought about 20 years of shared mornings and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, and something in me ached with a heaviness that had nothing to do with money. That was the real cost, the one no attorney could quantify. Not the hidden savings, not the wasted years of manufactured poverty, but the understanding that the intimacy I'd believed in had been performed, that I had been, in some fundamental way, managed. I let myself feel it. Then I called Meg. My daughter knew something was happening. I'd told her only that Daniel and I were separating, but she didn't know the details yet. We met for dinner at a restaurant in her neighborhood in Columbus, and over pasta and a glass of wine, I told her the truth. All of it. The safe. The cash. The 20 years of fabricated scarcity while her father sat on hidden wealth. The student loans she'd worked 3 years to pay off while he withdrew hundreds in cash every other Tuesday. Meg sat very still while I talked. When I finished, she put her fork down. "He let me do that," she said. "He let me struggle. While he—" Yes. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window for a moment. I watched my daughter absorb something that would take her a long time to fully process. Then she looked back at me with an expression I recognized, because it was the same one I saw in my own mirror. Not tears exactly. Something past tears. Clarity. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Right now, nothing. Just this." I gestured between us, the table, the wine, the simple fact of being together honestly. I needed to tell someone who deserved to know. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She held it longer than she needed to. After dinner, I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Less alone. It was a precise and specific comfort. I wasn't asking Meg to fix anything. I wasn't leaning on her in a way that would add to her burdens. But she knew now. She was a witness to the true story. And that mattered more than I can adequately explain. I also, that week, joined a women's divorce support group that met on Thursday evenings at a community center in Westerville. I was skeptical before the first meeting. I am not by nature a group-sharing person. But there were 8 women in that room, ranging in age from their 30s to their 60s, and every single one of them had sat in the particular silence of a marriage that had asked them to be smaller than they were. I didn't share everything, but I listened, and listening was enough. Gerald Webb had, by this point, located a second bank account, in Daniel's name only, opened 11 years earlier at a credit union in a neighboring county. The account held $420,000. $420,000. Quietly accumulated, quietly hidden. I thought about the back porch, the cracked dashboard, Meg's double shifts. I did not feel sad about what I was doing anymore. They came on a Sunday afternoon. I don't know why Sunday specifically struck me as a deliberate choice. Perhaps because it carried the implication of family, of warmth, of the kind of informal visit that bypasses formality and appeals directly to feeling. Daniel texted that morning. "Mom and I would like to stop by. Nothing official, just to talk as people." He knew better than to call. He knew I might not answer. I was under no obligation to let them in. Sandra had told me clearly, all communication should go through attorneys. But something in me, the same part that needs to look directly at what frightens it, said, "Let them come. See what they do when they think they have leverage." I texted back, "Fine, 2 o'clock." They arrived together, which told me this was coordinated. Patricia looked smaller than I remembered, but her posture was as composed as ever. Daniel was wearing a jacket, which meant he'd dressed for this, dressed for the performance of reasonableness. He carried a box of pastries from the bakery we used to go to on Saturday mornings, the gesture so calculated it almost made me laugh. I showed them to the living room. I didn't offer coffee. I sat in the armchair, not the sofa, which would have placed us in proximity, and I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Daniel opened. He spoke softly, with the particular cadence of a man who has practiced contrition, but not quite mastered sincerity. He said he understood I was angry. He said he should have been more transparent about their finances. He said, and here was the word that surprised me with its audacity, our finances, as if the credit union account and the safe and the 20 years of cash withdrawals had been a joint project. I was protecting us, he said. I know how that sounds, but I was worried about what would happen if things went wrong with the business. I wanted a cushion. I should have told you. I know that. I looked at him. Which business? I asked. A pause. What? You're an accountant at a firm, I said. You work for other people's businesses. What business were you protecting us from? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Patricia shifted in her seat. The accounts I managed, he said carefully. There was liability exposure. Laura, that's not the point. It's exactly the point, I said. You've just described a reason to hide assets, which is different from a reason to protect them. But please, continue. Patricia leaned forward then, and this was the moment the mask moved. Her voice dropped into something quieter and more direct, the diplomatic layer stripped away like paint from a wall. Laura, I want to be very clear with you, she said. You're a sensible woman. You know that what you're doing, this process, these accountants, these attorneys, it doesn't end with you getting everything you've imagined. It ends with everyone losing. The legal costs alone will consume whatever settlement the court awards. And there are aspects of Daniel's financial arrangements that, if they become public, would harm people beyond just this family. I held her gaze. What people? She blinked. I'm speaking generally, about the complexity of the situation. You said people, I said, not complexity. Who are you referring to, Patricia? The room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on Clover Street. I'm saying, Patricia said with careful precision, that it would be in your interest, and Meg's interest, to accept a fair settlement and close this matter. A generous settlement, far more than what Robert's office proposed last week. There it was. The number wasn't the offer. The mention of Meg was the offer. Bring your daughter into this. Let her feel the shadow of it. See if that moves you. I looked at my husband of 20 years and his mother, sitting in my living room on a Sunday afternoon with a box of pastries and a veiled threat, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of crystalline pity. They had spent so long managing people, managing me, that they no longer had access to any other approach. They genuinely believed I could be moved by this, that the woman who had silently lived their fiction for 2 decades was still available to be handled. I think you should go, I said. Daniel stood abruptly. Laura, if you push this into a full trial? Daniel! My voice was level. Take the pastries. Go. Have your attorney call Sandra. He looked at me for a long moment, and what I saw in his face was not anger, exactly. It was the particular disorientation of a man who has lost his instruments. He couldn't read me anymore, and that frightened him. They left without the pastries. I locked the door behind them and stood in the quiet hallway with my back against the wall. My heart was beating hard. My hands were cold. I'm not going to pretend I was fearless. The mention of people beyond the family, people who didn't react well to interference, lived in a part of my mind that I hadn't been able to fully close. I didn't know what it meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But here is what I discovered. Standing in that hallway with cold hands and a fast heartbeat, the fear didn't stop me. It sharpened me. Like water finding its level, my resolve settled into something very still and very sure. I called Sandra that evening. They came to the house, I said. Patricia made a reference to third parties who might be affected by disclosure. Not specific, but deliberate. There was a short pause on Sandra's end. That changes the picture somewhat, she said. Let me make some calls tomorrow. What kind of calls? The kind, Sandra said evenly, that bring in people with badges. Sandra's calls took 11 days. During those 11 days, I went about my life with the surface calm of someone who has accepted a diagnosis and is waiting for the treatment to take effect. I went to the Thursday evening group. I had dinner with Meg again. I raked the leaves in the backyard and painted the trim on the back porch. The trim that had been peeling for 4 years because we couldn't afford a can of exterior paint. Gerald Webb, working alongside a forensic team that Sandra had quietly engaged, had by then produced a document that ran to 31 pages. It detailed, in the dry and devastating language of financial analysis, the following. A second bank account at the Crawford County Credit Union with a balance of $420,000. A third account held jointly by Daniel and Patricia Mercer at a private bank in Cincinnati with a balance of $280,000, and a series of payments from that joint account to a shell company registered in Delaware, the beneficial owner of which was Daniel Mercer. Patricia was not, it turned out, simply Daniel's mother and advisor. She was his financial partner. The people she'd referenced in my living room were, in the understated assessment of one of Sandra's contacts, likely investors in a scheme that had been quietly running for over a decade. A tax sheltering arrangement that had moved from aggressive to illegal somewhere around the time our daughter was struggling through her second year of restaurant work. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division opened a case on a Thursday morning. I was not present for that. I was told about it by Sandra, briefly, with the same spare affect she used for everything. It's moving, she said. Be available next week. The court date for the formal asset disclosure hearing was set for a Wednesday. I wore the dark blue blazer I'd bought specifically for this season of my life. Not expensive, but clean and well cut. The kind of clothes that say, I am someone who is taking this seriously. I sat in the courthouse on 5th Street with Sandra beside me, and I watched Daniel and Robert Cahill take their seats across the aisle. Daniel looked diminished. That was the only word for it. Not physically. He hadn't visibly changed. But there was a quality of compression to him, as if the space he occupied had quietly contracted. He didn't look at me when he sat down. Patricia was not in the courtroom. Her attorney, a separate attorney, not Cahill, had filed her disclosure separately, which Sandra explained was a tactical attempt to create distance between mother and son, to prevent what was happening to one from contaminating the other. It wouldn't work. The accounts were joint. The paper trail was shared. The judge was a woman in her mid-50s named Honorable Deborah Marks, who had, Sandra had told me, approximately 0 patience for non-disclosure. What happened in the next 90 minutes was, from the outside, undramatic. It was paperwork. It was financial schedules and exhibits and the quiet, formal language of the law. But what it meant, stripped of formality, was this. Daniel's carefully constructed parallel life was being unfolded in a public courtroom, line by line, before a judge who was reading every number. Cahill tried, twice, to introduce characterizations of the accounts that reframed them as business reserves, as liability management, as funds held in trust for purposes Daniel had intended to disclose. Judge Marks stopped him both times. "Mr. Cahill," she said, the second time, with a patience that was clearly not patience at all, but its close, dangerous relative. "Your client's characterization of intent does not alter the fact of non-disclosure. Are we disputing the account balances themselves?" Cahill conferred with Daniel in a low voice. Daniel was shaking his head. "No, Your Honor," Cahill said. "The balances are not disputed." And there it was, the concession that ended the performance. I looked at Daniel then. I couldn't help it. Some 20-year habit of watching his face. And what I saw was not the man who had sat across from me at the kitchen table with his tidy spreadsheets. I saw someone who had been running a very long, very intricate story, and had finally arrived at the place where the story ended, and the facts remained. He looked tired. He looked small. He glanced at me, finally, briefly. I don't know what he expected to see. Remorse, maybe. Or the particular female softening that he'd relied on for 20 years to smooth over the places where his fiction had worn thin. I held his gaze steadily for a moment. Then I looked back at the judge. Outside, after, Sandra and I stood on the courthouse steps in the cold November air. A few dry leaves scraped across the stone. "How are you feeling?" she asked, which from Sandra was a remarkable question, evidence of some brief breach in her professional surface. "Ready?" I said. She gave me a single, precise nod. "Good, because we're not done." She was right. We weren't done. But for the first time in many months, I was walking towards something instead of away from it. The divorce was finalized on a gray afternoon in February. There was no ceremony to it, no dramatic confrontation, no tearful final conversation. Just papers, signatures, and the formal dissolution of a 20-year contract that had been, it turned out, built on a fault line. I sat in Sandra's office and signed where she indicated, and it was done. What I received was this: the marital home on Clover Street, free and clear, worth approximately $310,000. Half of the Crawford County Credit Union account, $210,000. Full proceeds from the sale of the 2019 Audi Q5. A car I had not known existed until Gerald found the registration in the shell company's records. $38,000. A lump sum payment of $175,000, representing my calculated share of the hidden cash, based on Gerald's conservative estimate of the safe's contents over the period of concealment. And a structured settlement covering my equitable share of the Cincinnati account, to be paid in installments over 4 years. The total, when Sandra's assistant typed the final column figure and slid it across the desk to me, was slightly over $1 million. I sat with that number for a moment. $1 million. The back porch, the cracked dashboard, Meg's student loans, the vacations we never took, all of it compressed into a number that represented, in the cold mathematics of the law, 20 years of a life that had been edited without my knowledge. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. I felt accurate, as if a long and distorted picture had finally been corrected. Daniel's situation was not good. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had completed their preliminary review and referred the matter to the Department of Justice. The shell company, it emerged, had been used to conceal income from 3 of Daniel's corporate clients, who had paid him for services rendered off the books for nearly a decade. The total unreported income was somewhere north of $800,000. That was a federal matter, and federal matters move slowly but conclusively. Robert Cahill had advised Daniel to cooperate fully with investigators, which he did, which also meant producing records that implicated Patricia. The Cincinnati account, opened jointly in 2009, had received transfers directly from the Delaware Shell Company. Patricia's position was, as Sandra put it with characteristic understatement, not comfortable. Patricia did not go to prison. She was 71 years old in assisted living, and her attorney successfully argued limited capacity. She had signed documents without full understanding of their implications. I don't know if I believed that, but it was the finding, and it meant that her consequences were financial rather than criminal. The joint account was seized as part of the federal investigation's asset forfeiture, and what remained after legal fees was significantly less than what she'd spent years accumulating. Daniel pled guilty in November of the following year to 2 counts of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, with credit for cooperation and time served. He would be required to pay back taxes, penalties, and interest totaling just over $1 million, which, when added to the divorce settlement, meant that the elaborate financial architecture he'd spent 20 years constructing was entirely dismantled. I was not at the sentencing. I didn't need to be. What I needed, and what I had by then, was a life that was mine and accountable to no one's fiction but my own. Meg and I sat in the backyard on a warm Sunday in March, the month after the divorce was finalized. She had paid off the last of her student loans 2 months earlier. I had insisted, and she had, after considerable argument, allowed it. The back porch had been properly repaired and painted the previous autumn. A small thing, but one I thought about more than I could easily explain. "How do you feel?" Meg asked, in the same tone people had been asking me this for months, cautiously, as if I might suddenly collapse now that the urgency was over. I looked at the backyard. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere. The sky was very blue. "Good," I said. And I meant it simply, without qualification. Not fine or managing or getting there. Good. Factually, specifically good. Meg leaned her head against my shoulder, briefly, the way she used to do when she was small. Then she straightened up and reached for her coffee. "He thought you were just going to keep being quiet," she said. "Yes," I said, "he did." "Why did he think that?" I thought about it. "Because I had been," I said, "for a very long time. The year after the divorce was the first year of my life that felt entirely like my own. I know how that sounds. At 51, to say that a year was the first that felt like mine. But there's a difference between a life that is functional and a life that is chosen. For 20 years, I had been living in a story someone else had authored, operating within margins drawn not by necessity, but by strategy. Now I was the one holding the pen. In April, I hired a contractor to renovate the kitchen. New counters, refinished cabinets, a window above the sink we'd always planned to enlarge but couldn't afford. I chose everything myself, based on what I liked rather than what was cheapest or least likely to generate an argument. In May, I took Meg to Portugal for 10 days. Lisbon and the Algarve coast. We walked for miles, ate long dinners, and sat on a cliff above the Atlantic one evening watching the sun go down. I thought about how many years I'd looked at travel books on the library shelves, telling myself, someday, when things ease up. Things hadn't eased up. I had simply stopped waiting for permission. "You're different," Meg said one evening over dinner. "Better?" "Yeah," she said, "better." I came home and started consulting part-time, helping small libraries with collection development. Work I knew well, work that got me out into the world. Carol came over Friday nights, and we cooked together and talked about things that had nothing to do with money or lawyers or the careful forensics of a life taken apart and rebuilt. It was a very good year. Daniel reported to a federal correctional facility in the spring. He'd sold his car and emptied his remaining accounts to cover back taxes and penalties. I don't know where he was living after that. I found I had limited interest in knowing. Patricia remained in assisted living. The Cincinnati account, the fund designated for her care, had been liquidated as part of the federal proceedings. The facility she ended up in was decent, but modest. She had made choices. Choices have consequences. That was a truth she had helped build herself. What I had now was a house I'd repainted, a kitchen I'd chosen, a passport with new stamps, a daughter who called twice a week, and Friday dinners with my sister. It was enough. More than enough. It was mine. So that's the story. 20 years, a safe under the stairs, and a woman who decided, one quiet Thursday night, that silence had cost her enough. Here's what I learned. A life that asks you to stay small to serve someone else's secrets is not a partnership. It's a performance. And the moment you stop performing, everything they built to control you starts to fall apart. If you had found what I found, that safe, those accounts, those 20 years of careful, deliberate lies, what would you have done? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, truly, for listening to the whole thing.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.